Now that we have an object on our screen that's moving, in this lesson we'll take a closer look at what we can do as far as a basic motion around the stage. We looked at a bit of this in the introductory chapter, and we're going to review some of that and look in even more detail at what's possible with a basic motion tween. So what we have is our symbol here. It was originally based on a symbol called rectangle, although we've drastically changed that shape. And we've created a brief motion tween animation where it moves in a straight line along our stage. This dotted line here is what's called a motion guide, and it indicates the direction of the motion and also the actual position of the object, or the symbol instance I should say, in the tween, in each frame. And as we saw in the introductory chapter, if I use my selection tool, I can treat this motion guide as a drawing object, or as any of the other objects that I've worked with as shapes, and I can, for example, move the endpoints around to change the location of the motion. I can bend the line using the selection tool by not selecting the line but dragging and dropping it to change the direction of the motion. I can even select the line itself and move it around the stage so that my tween takes place in a completely different area of the stage. I'm going to move it a little bit further back on screen here. And as we've already noticed, although I haven't called attention to it before, if I test my movie and see what it actually looks like as a file, that motion guide is nowhere to be seen. And we see the movie clip repeating endlessly as the shape moves along its invisible path. Let me close up this test window here. And let's take a look at what else we could do with a motion tween. First of all, the tween is a selectable object in our file. I can select the motion guide, and I see in the Properties panel that I've selected the motion tween, or I can select the tween area in the timeline. And this allows me to edit the properties of the tween itself. The first item that we see here in our panel is called ease. What we notice here along our motion guide is each of these points is evenly spaced along the length of the path. This means that the motion of the object along the path is going to be fairly uniform. But I can change that by changing the value of the ease. The ease can take a value anywhere between -100 and +100. And I can change the value by noticing that my mouse pointer has turned into a hand with a double-pointed arrow there, and sliding it along to change the value. For example, I can change it to 100, and I notice the word out appearing here. So a positive value is what's known as easing out, and that generally means that the motion is going to start off rather quickly and then slow down. And we can see this along the motion path now. We see that at the beginning of the motion, the initial frames, the dots are now quite spaced out, whereas where we get toward the end of the motion, we see they're closely spaced together. And we can see that reflected in the actual motion of the object. If I'm just hit the return or enter key to play back my movie, we see that it starts off quickly and then slows down, and that is called easing out, and that is a positive value of easing. If I'd like it to do the exact opposite, called easing in, starting off slowly and speeding up, I can change the ease value to a negative number, and we saw how I can change the value with a slider, but we can also just click on the value, and that opens up a text field where we can change the number. I'm going to change the +100 to a -100. And we see now that it says in here, so we're easing into the motion, and we see that the location of the dots along the path are very closely spaced together at the beginning and then spread out at the end, which means it's going to be covering very little distance at the beginning of the motion and a great deal of distance per frame toward the end. So it starts off slow and speeds up. And I can select any value in between. If I'd like to have an ease in but not quite so drastic, I can choose a negative value that's closer to 0, and it will start off slowly and speed up, but just a little bit. For this next part, I'm going to reset the easing value to 0. Oops. And we'll take a look at another part of the properties of a tween, which is that I can have my object, my symbol instance, rotate if I like. This used to be quite a bit more difficult to do in earlier versions of Flash, and they've made it very easy here. I can specify the number of times I'd like the symbol instance to rotate about its transformation point over the course of its motion. So for example, I can say that I would like it to rotate twice. And under the direction menu, once I set a value for the number of times it should rotate, I have to specify, is that going to be clockwise or counterclockwise? Let's make that clockwise, CW. And then we will see what happens with our instance now. We play back. And if we're very careful to count the somersaulting instance, we see that it turns around exactly twice between the first endpoint of the path and the last endpoint of the path. And if I'd like it to do something other than a whole number of rotations, I can use this value to add an additional rotation or even subtract it. But let's say I wanted to do an additional half turn. I can't slide off to the right any further, so I'll just change the value. And if I remember my geometry, a half turn is 180 degrees. So now we can see that in this frame, it's now upside down, which means it's done a half turn. And if I play back my movie, we see that it does 2.5 flips from the first frame to the last. So we can combine motion and rotation in the same tween. And if I, for example, only wanted to do a half turn, I can change the number of rotations to 0. And it will only do one half turn as it dives across the stage. Or if I want to, I can do it in a counterclockwise motion. And it will rotate the opposite way as it moves.